A crucial element of United States foreign policy is the PDB, but you may never have heard of the PDB. The PDB is the President's daily brief. Every morning, the President of the United States is greeted in the Oval Office by his Director of National Intelligence. The Director hands the President a slender leather binder. In this binder is a wealth of information. In fact, it may be as close as anyone ever gets to having a crystal ball to forecast the future. The PDB contains the distillation of an $80 billion annual budget of intelligence collection focused on the previous 24 hours. This intelligence is analyzed into crystalline form for the President's thoughtful consideration. The Presidential Daily Brief is the nation's best estimate of what will happen in the next 24 hours, in the next week. The President uses this information for the crafting of prudent foreign policy. Now, the objective of the PDB is to reduce uncertainty so that critical decisions can be taken with as much surety as possible. Is it really a crystal ball? Is it infallible? Of course not. But it serves a valuable function. It is surely better than the alternative of no reasonable assessments of the resources, capabilities, and intentions of our friends and enemies. Wouldn't it be great to have a PDB for our own use every day? Wouldn't it be great if the CEO had at least a weekly brief on all his competitors, a professional assessment of likely courses of action? We constantly try to extend the horizon of what we know. The sooner we know it, the better. The better we know it, the sooner we can react. We all want to know the future for our own decision-making, and yet the future is unknowable. This is the topic of today's lecture, the mystery of the future, and how it affects our thinking and decision-making in conditions of competition. How the mystery of the future affects our strategy-making. We want to push out our view of the future, extend our vision as far as possible, yet simultaneously, the horizon of the future gets closer every day. In spite of a cascade of information, our ability to see into the future seems more limited than ever. We are awash in information, but we have less and less time to react to unexpected events, and so the future presents us with a paradox. We search in vain for the certain decision under conditions of uncertainty. Now, is there any way we can resolve this conundrum to our advantage? This lecture explores the horizon of the future and discusses ways that the military and select corporations extend their view over that horizon. In the process, we learn how our own future-oriented thinking can clarify the options available to us and help us select the appropriate action. Let's begin with business. Uncertainty in the business world means risk, political risk, credit risk, economic risk, and all of the permutations and subsidiary issues that go with risk. And risk, uncertainty, costs money. Businesses have to mitigate the perceived risks with insurance and a host of other risk mitigation techniques. Businesses want to reduce uncertainty so as to reduce risk and the costs of doing business. So here's the CEO's most important question. What's the future? In fact, this is often the most important question at various levels of the corporate hierarchy, and it's often the most important question in our personal lives as well. Anyone who faces competitive situations has an insatiable desire to know the future. We want to know what's going to happen. It's more than just idle curiosity. We believe that the more we know, the better our decision-making. And this is more than likely correct. Even parents can think this way as they try to help their children meet the challenges of a competitive world. But the future eludes us, just out of our reach, shrouded in an impenetrable fog. Everyone in leadership positions and everyone faced with competitive challenges longs for knowledge of what will happen. We hunger for knowledge about the future, even if only a sliver of truth that can afford us a fleeting competitive advantage. In a highly charged and competitive business world, knowing as much as possible about the future of our business, our industry, our competitors, our market is a necessity. Insider trading, at bottom, is acting on exclusive information about the future so as to profit by trading on that information. In this case, exclusive information about the future provides a carefully circumscribed temporary advantage. It should be clear how the exclusive information in this case renders a decision clearer, more certain. But this is a finite case, sometimes dealing with a single datum of information about a single future scenario. Moreover, the action to be taken is clear, to buy or not to buy. And in a broader context, we want to know what decisions to take, and we want to know how our competitors will respond to those decisions. Move and counter-move with 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 or more competitors moving against us. Simultaneously, we want to know how the market will respond to our actions. And we want to know if our firm or our army or we ourselves have the capability to confront the unknown challenges. It's the quest for the certain decision in conditions of uncertainty. This concept, the future, is slippery. Some folks may believe it's easy to see into the future, if only for a short distance in time. This type of confidence is born of arrogance and the ignoring of context. It's a view that perceives the future as somehow linear, as on a singular path, and is obvious. This type of shallow consideration founders on the rocks of incorrect assumptions, or it founders on assumptions about reality that have changed since they were first adopted. And in reality, seeing into the future is a difficult, almost impossible exercise, even for the $80 billion per year intelligence establishment of the United States. How difficult is it to see into the future? Let's take a simplified version of the future and see how people regularly attempt to predict it. Take, for instance, the game of chess. The chess game is a circumscribed and fully comprehensible activity. Each player commands 8 pieces and 8 pawns. The game is played on a square board divided into light and dark squares, 64 in total. One player moves a piece, and then the opposing player moves. In this game, we sometimes ascribe mystical powers to the best players in the world, the international grandmasters of the game. We attribute to them the ability to see ahead several moves in the game. How else can these players assemble elegant and complex combinations leading to victory? So how far into the future does a grandmaster see? 10 moves? 8 moves? 6 moves? How about just 4 moves? Surely it's not outlandish to assume that an international grandmaster such as Garry Kasparov can see just 4 moves into the future. But the future is not that easy. There are 40 possible variations in a chess game's first move. Seeing one full move ahead means knowing 1,600 positions. Seeing just 2 moves into the future involves 2.5 million possible positions. 3 moves, 4 billion possibilities. And for the 4th move, the possibilities available run to 318,979,564,000 different variations. That's about 319 billion possibilities. It should be quite obvious that the chess master doesn't see very far into the future at all. In fact, after just 2 moves, he's confronted with a sheer cliff of 2.5 million possibilities, impossible to scale. Now, back to the reality that you and I face each day. Back to the reality of the business leader confronted with problems of complexity that defy description. Think of our CEO, confronted with such a multiplicity of variables as to make a chess player weep. Our CEO butts against that sheer wall of possibilities almost immediately as he begins to think of the future. How can we even begin to grasp the reality, the complexity of it all? When does the CEO decide on an action? Too soon, and all could be lost. Too late, and all could be lost. At what point do we heed the cliché that we mustn't let the perfect become the enemy of the good? The paradox is that we all want perfect information in situations whose conditions guarantee that we will never have it. But at some point, we must declare the case closed. We must assert that no new information will be admitted into the decision process. So how can we possibly construct a process to get through this briar patch of obfuscation? Fortunately, there's a tool available to us that provides a mid-range solution. It's called scenario analysis. Military establishments have used a version of scenario analysis for decades. War is probably the ultimate competitive activity, and military intelligence has found it a helpful way to understand and predict enemy actions. In business, scenario analysis is a competitive analysis tool first used by Royal Dutch Shell in the 1960s. In both business and the military, the concept of scenario analysis is to assemble a menu of alternative futures. Think of these alternative futures as stories about the future. The word itself, scenario, comes from the theater, which is an outline of the plot of a dramatic or literary work and which includes information about its characters and its scenes. Likewise, analysis is a tool that is, in essence, a story with a plot and with characters. These scenarios, they're not blind guesses. They're the product of a venerable tradition of counterfactual history. It's a technique of asking, what if, with respect to key drivers that impact us or our organization. One way of thinking about scenario analysis is to consider a movie that was made based on the classic board game Clue. Clue is a murder mystery board game that was created in England in 1948. It was first sold in the U.S. by Parker Brothers under the name of Clue in 1949. Players attempt to solve the mystery of who killed Mr. Boddy, B-O-D-D-Y. The game was made into a 1985 comedic motion picture. And in an unusual twist, 3 versions of the film with 3 different endings were made, and they were shown in different theaters around the country. And that's the point. The film had 3 equally plausible endings. Each of the endings, or scenarios, incorporated the same elements or clues, but yielded different results. And this is what we do in scenario analysis. Scenario analysis requires us to consider the elements we develop as part of our investigation process and to assemble them into equally plausible stories about the future. In the original method of scenario analysis, theories about the future would be generated by keen-minded experts. Again, not just one future, but several futures. It's really scenarios analysis. Scenarios are indeed stories about the future, and these stories help to clarify for us the choices available. Peter Schwartz is a futurist who did his early work in scenario analysis at Stanford Research Institute in the 1970s. He then became a scenario analyst for Royal Dutch Shell Corporation in the 1980s. Schwartz said this about the utility of scenarios. They form a method for articulating the different pathways that might exist for you tomorrow and finding your appropriate movements down each of those possible paths. Scenario planning is about making choices today with an understanding of how they might turn out. Most of us are already familiar with the idea of scenario planning. We may actually have engaged in it at some point. We may know it by a different name: training, rehearsal, standard operating procedure, or contingency plan. In essence, the construction of scenarios allow us to rehearse the future. Many organizations rehearse the future, particularly those organizations tasked with critical missions: the Army, Navy, and Air Force, the police, fire departments, early responders of every stripe. All of them rehearse the future. Military basic training, that's the application of scenario rehearsal. The nation's more elite troops constantly rehearse various likely scenarios, some of them highly unlikely. Delta Force, the United States Anti-Terrorist Response Unit, and the Navy's SEAL Team 6 or DEVGRU do nothing but rehearse for the future in every scenario imaginable. In sports, too, teams rehearse the future. In fact, football is a complex laboratory for scenario analysis. Players are taught to read opposing formations and to react to them within seconds. Teams relentlessly practice situational responses. If situation A arises, then my opponent has certain options open to it. Consequently, my team practices responses X, Y, and Z. One of the most important aspects of effective scenario analysis is that the response is rehearsed under conditions that closely resemble the actual projected event. Sports teams practice scenario responses under game-like conditions. Elite commandos train under hyper-realistic conditions, including the use of live ammunition in exercises. My own experience with scenario analysis, planning, and response was with NATO during the Cold War in NATO tactical evaluation exercises. These exercises were conducted under conditions as realistic and severe as training limits would allow. These could be considered rehearsals of the future, rehearsing the possibilities of a massive Soviet attack across the German border. Several NATO countries provided officers as referees: Germans, Belgians, British. Our unit, a Hawk missile battalion, would inaugurate an exercise, deploying as it would during a Soviet attack. The sites and scenarios would vary, but the procedures were invariably the same as we responded to the various scripts given to us over a period of days. Action, and then response. Action, and then response. Putting stress on the unit, imposing casualties, pushing it hard, even harder, until eventually the unit fails. In business, too, war games are used to simulate crisis decision-making in likely scenarios involving competitors. These exercises have the advantage of moving senior management out of the structured corporate board meeting, where certain options might be taboo for discussion. Those options can then be surfaced in the war games. This is where conventional thinking and the official party line can be safely challenged. In all of these examples, the linking thread is rehearsal. Said Peter Schwartz, "You run through the simulated events as if you were already living them. You train yourself to recognize which drama is unfolding. That helps you avoid unpleasant surprises and then know how to act." Royal Dutch Shell pioneered and led the use of scenario planning in the business world. At the time, this was quite bold and it was unconventional. But the origins of this approach arose from the early work of nuclear strategy theorist Herman Kahn. Herman Kahn can be called the father of scenario analysis. Kahn became famous in developing his scenarios about nuclear war when he worked for the Rand Corporation in the 1950s, thinking about the unthinkable. At the time, he was roundly criticized for actually thinking logically about a future in which nuclear weapons could be used. Kahn served as an uncooperative model for the title character in the Stanley Kubrick film, Dr. Strangelove. His only transgression, if you can call it that, was not ducking the issue of nuclear war. Instead, he thought long and hard about how various futures might play out. At Shell in the late 1960s, scenario planning emerged for a very specific reason. Pierre Wack introduced scenario planning into Shell. His premise was that some things are predictable. It is necessary to assume that some things are predictable. If the future, after all, is 100% unknowable, then planning is useless. And so scenarios were introduced as a way to plan without having to predict things that everyone knew were unpredictable. It was a mid-range solution. The task, as Wack saw it, was to separate what is predictable from what is fundamentally uncertain. Now, the predictable elements are called predeterminants. The predeterminants would appear in each scenario in the same predictable way. The uncertainties, however, would interact and play out in different ways as the horizon of the future extended. With this as the groundwork, let's look at the objectives of scenario planning and then at one example of the step-by-step process. Scenario planning has three basic objectives. The first objective is to generate projects and decisions that are more robust under a variety of different futures. The notion of more robust projects and decisions is truly elegant. Rather than measure a proposal against the best possible scenario, it's measured against all the scenarios that emerge from the process. Projects are crafted to perform to minimum expectations under all the scenarios. A scenario-based culture is suffused throughout an organization so that projects and decisions are weighed against several possible futures instead of the future that may be preferred. The second objective is to improve the quality of our thinking about the future. rather than a unidimensional, linear thought process that yields a single official future. Scenario planning stretches our minds. It forces us to consider possibilities otherwise dismissed, perhaps dismissed prematurely. The third objective is to deepen and enrich the way people interpret the information around them, which becomes notably and qualitatively different than the thinking of others. One Shell executive summarized it this way: at Shell, scenarios are designed to think the unthinkable and to challenge conventional wisdom. If one looks at the early scenarios developed at Shell, you can see clearly that they not only told stories about the future, but that they also identified risks, established milestones, or indicators to monitor, and in the end, sometimes led to actual management action. Obviously, an organization like Shell devotes tremendous resources to its scenarios. It is a complex process, but we can make use of a similar process in our personal decision-making. Here's the basic process for scenario planning. It involves asking and answering a series of questions. First, identify the focal issue or decision. What is it that you already do and why? What is it that you want to do? This issue is generated by the mission of the firm and the objectives that arise from the striving to accomplish that mission. Second, what are the key factors in the local environment? What do you consider your success indicators? What are your assumptions about key factors such as customers, suppliers, competitors, and other identifiable stakeholders? Identify the players in the scenario, the actors in the play. Third, what are the driving forces in the macro environment that influence the key factors that you identified earlier? In this step, we include issues such as demographic shifts, industry growth, technology progress and pace, activity of competitors, and such like. Fourth, rank the factors and forces by impact and by uncertainty. Here you look for critical uncertainties. The scenarios cannot differ over predeterminates, since these are the same in every alternative scenario. Examples of two forces might be, say, the uncertainty surrounding default of the United States on its debt, and the volatility of public opinion over a particular initiative. Fifth in the process, select your scenario logics. This means you operationalize your environmental drivers. You develop these factors on two axes, both measured as high and low. You plot a 2-by-2 matrix of impact, high or low, and uncertainty, high or low. And this matrix yields 4 possibilities involving the major uncertainties identified in step 4. The sixth step is to flesh out the scenarios and weave the pieces into a narrative. You're telling a story about the future. And seventh, you determine the implications of each scenario on your original focal issue. Here is where you rehearse the future. In other words, evaluate how your decision plays out in each scenario, and each of the 4 possibilities in your 2-by-2 matrix. Eighth, we identify and select leading indicators that alert us to the actual direction that history is taking. It's helpful to name each scenario, a descriptive terminology that captures the spirit and the dynamic of what is actually going on. For instance, crisis mode, open market dynamic, or cup runneth over. Scenario analysis is a powerful tool, and this was demonstrated at Royal Dutch Shell soon after its adoption. Up until 1965, corporate planning was based on a technique called predict and control. This was the development of a single-line forecast of the future based on clear questions. At Shell, this course was modified to include several scenarios, but each scenario was given a probability of occurrence. This was not an advance over the old method. But at that point, Shell instituted its current scenario planning process, the development of equally plausible scenarios with a focus on causality, not probability. The notion was to stretch the thinking of its executives. It was to move them out of linear thought processes that yielded an obvious future, and to get them to consider possibilities less probable but catastrophic if realized. The first major test of Shell's scenario planning process came in the early 1970s. The question to be considered was the price of oil. Logical, given Shell's business. The company developed 6 scenarios initially, one of which was counterintuitive at the time. This became known as the crisis scenario, in which the oil-producing countries would cease producing oil at a rate that was unprofitable to those controlling the supply. This scenario predicted the 1973 oil shock and Arab embargo, when everyone else was surprised. As a result, Shell was more prepared than any other company to deal with the crisis, having already thought through its implications beforehand. Subsequently, Shell consistently bettered other oil companies. It correctly forecast the overcapacity in the tanker business and Europe's petrochemicals, and recognized the denouement of these predictions earlier than its competitors. Big organizations such as Shell and the United States military can utilize scenario planning, but we can engage in it as well. We can utilize the concept of rehearsing for the future in our personal lives in many ways. Once you think about it, ways to apply scenarios in our own lives are obvious most of the time, but many of us rarely take advantage of the process. Young people entering the workforce would benefit tremendously from rehearsing their job interviews in advance, to arm themselves with the skills necessary to answering questions deftly. But aside from the mock interview procedures enacted by some business schools, young people rarely take advantage of this. Even when we know we're entering into a stressful situation whose parameters are known, we rarely rehearse for the future in such a way that accurately duplicates the activity itself. You neat and construct an elaborate schema of scenarios. Your scenarios can be as simple as asking yourself a series of what-if questions based on your judgment of the different ways that things might play out. And then you rehearse the options you identify. One of the most useful scenario-related activities is our response to the task of delivering a speech. The craft of a speech and a rehearsal for a public speaking engagement offers us a wonderful opportunity to engage in scenario planning. This activity carries the same basic elements of the Shell scenario planning process. It has predeterminates and it carries uncertainties. The predetermined aspect is the speech itself, the venue, the time, and all of the logistical arrangements that you can count on. The uncertainties relate mainly to the give and take of the question and answer period afterward. Other negative uncertainties that may impact the event are environmental factors such as bad weather, audio-visual equipment failure, heating or cooling problems, and such like. How do you respond to these eventualities? Well, one solution is to game out what you will do in advance. With respect to your speech, practice in the room where you deliver it. Answer tough questions from a friend designed to prepare you for that eventuality. Even if you aren't asked any of the same questions, you have benefit of the pressure beforehand, and practice these eventualities exactly as you'll perform them, not with starting and stopping and fidgeting. At times, the uncertainties are almost impossible to predict, in which case it's best to craft standardized, robust responses that will serve you in almost any situation. My own responses are conditioned from my experience in such situations. For instance, there can be a tremendous difference in preparing to deliver a speech in the United States and delivering one in a foreign country. I learned this difference the hard way as I arrived to deliver a talk at a political headquarters in the city of Izhevsk, Russia, several years ago. Every expectation I had of the event was destroyed in succession, including the language spoken. I expected a small, private, round-table discussion in English, but I arrived to find something entirely different. I arrived to find a televised press conference entirely in Russian. I was introduced not as a visiting professor, but as a political organizer visiting from the United States to provide advice to the local political party. In 2003, I was introduced to a college audience in the city of Ufa, Bashkortostan, not as a visiting professor, but as a former CIA agent who was calling for war with Iraq. Could even the best scenario planning have predicted either of the above occurrences? Maybe. When planning a presentation to an unfamiliar audience, scenario planning would mean anticipating a full range of possible expectations and reactions from the audience. And that is the lesson here. That's what real scenario planning is all about. With experience, We can learn how to prepare robust responses. Responses so robust, in fact, that they can handle a very wide variety of situations. To bring us full circle, we close with a revisit of the President's daily brief. It's as close as we'll probably come to a crystal ball to foretell the future, but even the PDB has its limitations. Take the PDB of August 6, 2001, which was entitled Bin Laden Determined to Strike in U.S. Many have pointed to this memorandum as some kind of smoking gun to hold the presidential administration somehow culpable in ignoring warnings. But armchair analysts are always bold in hindsight and see a clear warning where none is really present. The PDB offers analyzed information that suggests general directions for a future event, but it's only when such intelligence is combined with scenario planning that it becomes more fully and immediately actionable. This is a lesson for all of us. These days, you can have websites and paid analysts sending you electronic streams of high-quality intelligence, day or night, 24/7. But your ability to use that intelligence will vastly improve and may ultimately depend on the scenarios that you create and rehearse. The future remains an enigma for us, and it probably always will. It confounds CEOs, presidents, and generals leading armies of thousands, and it confounds us. But in this lecture, we learn that we can dissipate some of the fog that befuddles us. We can improve our thinking and sharpen our decision-making processes by considering more than one scenario. We cannot know the future, but we can plan for multiple futures. In fact, with the use of scenario analysis, we need not fear the unknown. We can march forward quite confident, knowing that our projects and our decisions can withstand even the worst of the possibilities that strike.